Welcome to Attributions. Today we're speaking with Hans Nicholas Jong. Hans is a journalist in Indonesia and a staff writer at Mongabay, where he's been writing for 6 years about environmental issues surrounding palm oil, indigenous land rights, carbon trading, deforestation, energy transition, and much more. Previously, Hans was a journalist at the Jakarta Post for 5 years. I spoke with Hans about a wide range of issues, from palm oil and its impacts on deforestation in Indonesia, the impact of palm oil plantations on indigenous people and local communities, corruption, land rights, biofuels, carbon offsets, and reforestation. It was great speaking with Hans, and I hope you enjoy the conversation. All right, we're rolling. We're here with Hans Nicholas Jong. Hans, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
So I would have introduced you in the pre-recorded introduction, Hans, but I'm just wondering if you could just tell us a little bit about who you are, your background, and what you're working on lately.
Sure. So my name is Hans Nicholas Jong, and I'm Indonesian. I live here, and I've been working as a journalist for the past decade. Right now, I'm working for this environmental news website called Mongabay. We have a number of bureaus around the world, and we are dedicated to reporting on environmental issues such as conflicts between indigenous peoples and companies, deforestation, loss of wildlife habitat, etc.
Cool. How'd you actually become interested in the work that you're doing now? I love asking this question because everyone's story is pretty unique. So I guess what drove you into covering, say, environmental issues?
Yeah, sure. So this is actually, I think it is by accident, because when I finished college, I didn't know what to do. Journalism is not something that it is basically not on my radar, right? So, but then I decided to try journalism. First I started working for a newspaper called the Jakarta Post. At that time, I focused on issues such as politics, corruption, and social issues, such as health and education. But then one time, my editors asked me to start writing more about environmental issues, because at that time there was not a dedicated environmental journalist at the Jakarta Post. So that's how I ended up, writing about environmental issues. And then I realized that these issues is such a complicated and such a major issue in my country. There's a lot of things that I could write about. So it is basically, it presents me with this huge opportunity as a journalist to, expand my skills. And yeah, it also gives me opportunity to travel around the country, to talk to people whom I might not be able to talk to if I'm not working as an environmental journalist. There's definitely a lot of challenges. I have to deal with companies, with government. So yeah, it's something that's, for me personally, it is something that's really rewarding and quite exciting.
Now, I mean, you mentioned you've traveled quite a lot with your work, and Indonesia is quite a big place.
Yep.
How extensively have you covered Indonesia in terms of just environmental issues? Like, have you been from east to west, north to south?
Yes, practically yes. The furthest east I've been to for reporting is Papua. And I've been to the easternmost region of Papua, Merauke, to report on palm oil companies and their conflicts with indigenous peoples there. So yeah, but even if I've been working as an environmental journalist for, I don't know, like 7 or 8 years, there's still a lot of regions that I've never covered before. Like, for example, Maluku. I've never been to Maluku. So yeah, so this is just to show you how big the country is, how it is. I think it's basically impossible for me to cover the whole country by myself. Even if I focus only on one topic, let's say palm oil, it's because there's just the scale is just too humongous. So yeah, so that's, I don't know if that answers the question, but yeah.
No, that's fine. It's just interesting to hear because Indonesia is such a big country, super diverse place. Lots of different languages, lots of different ethnicities. It's so yeah, I was just wondering where where you've been to, and I wanted to actually talk about the Papua, Indonesian Papua, later. But I guess a good place to get started on deforestation in general in Indonesia, I think it would be a good idea to just to provide some context. And I feel as though Southeast Asian forests and deforestation, for example, don't get nowhere near as much attention as they should compared to, say, the Amazon rainforest, for example, in international press. And I mean, I had another journalist on the show talking about Malaysia's issues as well, and the impacts on indigenous people in Malaysia, and that also gets so little press. And I'm sure like Indonesia can kind of fall in that same kind of bucket of not getting much attention. So I'm just wondering why, from your perspective, why do you think this is the case? Despite, for example, Indonesia having some of the most biodiverse forests and some of the most oldest forests in the world.
Yeah, I think if we're talking about why Indonesia seems invincible, I think like in general, we're not only talking about forests, but like the country in general. If I'm not mistaken, like there's a saying that Indonesia is the largest invincible country in the world because we are like this huge population of 270 million people, and we're the largest like Muslim population in the world. But there seems to be not a lot of attention being paid towards Indonesia. I don't think we have that big of a presence internationally. I've heard so many things. I've heard from so many people that like if we are going to the UN climate events COP, like Indonesia, I think we might have the biggest delegates. We have the largest number of people representing the country, but there doesn't seem to be a lot of discussions revolving around Indonesia. I think more focus is going towards countries like Brazil. I don't know. Personally, I don't know why that is. Why is that the case? But I think in terms of forests, it might be easier to. I don't know. I think if you're talking about forests in Brazil, like Amazon, it's more attractive and it's easier. It's more compelling because it is like this huge tract of rainforest in a single region, right? But if you're talking about Indonesia, of course we have. I don't know. I think we are the second or the third largest tropical rainforest country in the world, but they are being separated into all these multiple islands. And I think in terms of biodiversity, we are quite big in that regard. If I'm not mistaken, we have the second or third most biodiversity. And I think we are number one in terms of mammals. But in terms of like birds, I think Amazon is still number one. But still, I think there's not much attention being paid towards Indonesia's forests.
I mean, to me, it seems a bit crazy because, it's such a important piece of the world and there's so many people. And, if we're to take climate change just as a big, broad example, I mean, Indonesia's role is huge. And the fact that, not too many people are paying attention to it, it seems to me that needs to change,
Right.
especially in terms of, how we decide to progress on certain issues.
Okay.
So I think, let's start by talking about palm oil. And you mentioned palm oil earlier, and its links to deforestation, and you've covered this really extensively, at least from my readings, and of course what you've mentioned to us just before. So I guess, how far back does palm oil's history go, if you can talk about that a little bit? And I guess, from your perspective, why has Indonesia kind of decided to take this resource path? Has it been because of a demand from palm oil, domestically, or a demand for palm oil internationally?
I think this is like contrary to popular belief. Palm oil actually comes from Africa, but a lot of stakeholders here, they like to frame palm oil as something that is, well, they're not claiming that palm oil is from Indonesia, but they frame it as something that is like our, I don't know, like something like natural, our national resource, because our climate and soil condition, they are suitable for the crop. So, but in fact, palm oil, they actually come from Africa. If I'm not mistaken, they were actually brought by the Dutch colony, because we were used to be colonized by the Dutch for I think more than 300 years, and then they brought palm oil to Indonesia back in 1800s. And the first thing that they did was they tried to plant the crops in Bogor, which is located in the outskirts of Jakarta. So they tried plant some trees in the Bogor botanical gardens, but I think the results were not good. I believe they found that palm oil was not really suitable. So in the end, these palm oil trees, they were used more as a decoration, like for example, road decoration, and also like garden. Like some people might plant them on their backyards as more as like a decoration rather than for livelihoods. And then the Dutch colony, they tried to plant palm oil in a number of regions in the country, particularly in Sumatra, but the results also were not good. But and I think it was not until they tried developing it in North Sumatra, in the northern part of the Sumatra island, when they found out that, oh, actually this is quite possible. This is actually something that's that can have like economical value. So they found out that the results were quite good when they planted the crops in North Sumatra, and so from there they started to plant the crops elsewhere in the country. And it wasn't until 1911 that that palm oil began to become a mainstay commodity. And then after that, the crops started to spread elsewhere in the country. And I think it wasn't until 1990s that palm oil started to become like this really huge industry in the country, because it was bolstered by the government. The government issued policies that promote the expansion of the industry. And I don't know if you know, but in 1997 or 1998, we decided to decentralize our government. So the central government basically give a lot of freedom and authorities to local governments. So at a time, so from that time, these local governments, they saw the palm oil industry as something that is like a easy cash grab. So they decided to give all these permits to companies, to plantation companies, for them to expand their palm oil plantations. So that's why we started seeing this rapid expansion of the palm oil industry started in 1990s. So after that, the palm oil industry became really huge, and because of that, there's also large scale deforestation that comes from it. I have a number of figures. So, for example, there's a study that shows that palm oil was responsible for 1/3 of Indonesia's loss of old growth forests over the last 2 decades. And another study found that palm oil was the largest single driver of deforestation between 2001 and 2016. So, so basically, this rapid expansion of palm oil industry, which was not controlled by any means, because we actually don't have any cap on how big the palm oil industry can grow. So this rapid expansion comes with deforestation. But in recent years, actually, rate of deforestation that comes from palm oil has started to decrease. This is probably because the lands that are available for these plantations have basically gone down quite rapidly because of this massive scale of deforestation, and also because these new plantations, they are increasingly developed on non-forested lands. So because we have depleted our forests, so these plantations, they have no other option than to started looking at non-forested lands.
It kind of reminds me when you say about the rate of deforestation is decreased because they're finding less and less available land.
Right.
And I mean, I guess a big part of this has to do with the fact that, you know, if you look at tropical forest soil, you know, the topsoil is so thin, right? You know, once you chop down all the trees, that stuff just washes away with the next rain, for example. And then, you know, you've got soil with little to no nutrients left in it. And then the only way they're able to grow, you know, extensive kind of industrial palm oil is to just pound chemical fertilizers into the ground. I mean, is the chemical runoff causing any problems as well? You know, apart from the deforestation, is the amount of pesticides and fertilizers causing big problems?
Yeah, if I'm not mistaken, there's number of reports that found that this use of chemical fertilizers they polluted the water of local communities because this water they ended up in river streams, they ended up in the ocean. So it makes it difficult for local communities to use their water because they obviously they rely on this water for their daily lives, right? For washing clothes, for showering, for drinking. But yeah, so definitely there's an impact on that.
When there's a particular resource, and unless, you know, if we're talking about palm oil, I mean, what's the domestic market like there? Is palm oil particularly important in Indonesia? Do a lot of people use it, or is it mostly for international markets? I think I read something recently about a company getting fined for illegally selling overseas to make more of a profit. Because I think the domestic prices in Indonesia are capped, so they were trying to like make more money. I mean, is the market quite big in Indonesia, or is most of this for international?
Yeah, most definitely. It is quite a big market in Indonesia. If I'm not mistaken, we are actually one of the largest consumer of palm oil in the world. So we are the largest producer and exporter of the commodity, right? But we are also one of the largest market for palm oil. We're still behind countries like China and India, but we are definitely up there. So I have some figures. So for example, last year we produced around like 45 million metric tons of palm oil. And from that figure, we consume less than half, but it's still quite a lot, like almost 20 million metric tons, like around 18 million metric tons. So we are definitely consuming a lot of palm oil. It is because, well, it's because one of the reasons why is because we have a huge biodiesel market in the country because there's a government mandate to blend palm oil with fossil fuel in order to to increase the domestic consumption of palm oil. So I believe we have the most ambitious biodiesel blending target in the world. Right now we are at 35, if I'm not mistaken, and we are going to like 40% of mixture between palm oil and diesel. And other than this huge biodiesel market, we also use palm oil for a lot of products like shampoo, soaps, like cooking oil. We are definitely big on cooking oil. A lot of our culinary rely on like frying and using cooking oil from palm oil. So that's why we consume a lot of palm oil.
I just wanted to go back to, you mentioned a lot of impacts on communities and particularly like conflicts between communities and say palm oil plantations, the industry itself. And I'm just wondering what you've reported on and what the situation is like in some communities in Indonesia. Is conflict happening more or less these days between communities that have been affected by deforestation, or how's it looking?
Yeah, so there's still a lot of conflicts lingering between communities and companies in Indonesia. A lot of these conflicts, they remain unresolved because it is actually quite difficult to solve these conflicts due to a lot of reasons. For one, these conflicts might have been festering for decades, and these communities, although they have lived on that lands for many years, but in a lot of cases, they don't have the legal certificates, so that it is quite difficult for them to argue about their land rights to the companies and also to the government. And at the same time, it is quite easy for companies in the country to get certificates, to get permits, licenses from the government. So this disparity between communities and companies in terms of the easiness for them to get legal certificates, this has fueled all these conflicts. If I'm not mistaken, there are about 4,000 unresolved land conflicts between communities and oil palm companies in the country. This is from official data from the Indonesia's National Land Agency. And in recent years, we have started seeing new conflicts coming from the plantation industry. In terms of number, I think it's fluctuating, but still, the palm oil industry is one of the major driver of land conflicts in Indonesia. If I'm not mistaken, last year there were about like 99 cases of land conflicts caused by the plantation industry.
Are most of the conflicts, are they being won by the communities or are they being won by the industry? Like, is there quite a, I guess, a contrasting power imbalance there that's happening?
And I think, based on my reporting experience, there have only been few cases where the communities actually got their land rights back from the companies. This is because, let's say, if they go into the court, if they're taking the legal course, it is it is a very lengthy process, and it is also very costly. And sometimes the judges, they will side with companies instead of local communities. Again, because these communities, these local and indigenous communities, they don't have the legal certificates, so it is very hard for them to argue their cases in front of the judges. But in some cases where the companies show like good will, they might be willing to relinquish parts of their concessions to these local communities. But I think in general, it is still companies that emerge victorious compared to local communities.
How does it kind of work? Say, for example, there's a palm oil company. Basically, you mentioned earlier before that the system of government is decentralized, so you've got local governments making the decisions. So, for example, does a palm oil company just go to the local government to apply for, say, a land permit or some sort of permit to develop the land?
So it is actually, compared to local communities, it is still relatively easier for companies to get permits, but still, because of all these bureaucracies and red tapes, these companies still have to, spend a lot of time to get all these permits, because we have actually, I think, 4 or 5 different kinds of permits in order for a company to start operating. So, for example, you need to have the environmental permits. You need to have the land permits. You need to have the business permits, and you need to have like the location permits, for example, from the local government. So you need to actually speak to different government agencies at different level of bureaucracies. You need to go to the local governments. You need to talk to like the mayors, district heads, and then you still have to talk to the central government. In this case, you need to talk to the Ministry of Environment and Forestry in case the areas that you're interested in is located in forest areas, for example. You need to talk to them to get this license called the forest conversion permit. So this permit will convert the status of the area from forest area to non-forest area. So that way you can build plantation there. And then after that, at the end of the process, you need to have this permit called HGU, which is the right to cultivate permit from the National Land Agency. So I think more or less there are like 4 or 5 different permits that you need to acquire before establishing a plantation.
What's been the general reaction in your experience when you've been talking to communities that are either, in a legal battle or trying to protect their land, how have they been? What's their kind of attitude towards the situation, especially considering that they live there and that their land is being affected? How are they thinking about everything?
Well, in general, most of these communities, they are tired because a lot of these conflicts, they have been, going on for decades. And I think their tiredness comes from the fact that they have to live with uncertainties. Like, for example, if they sleep, then tomorrow morning when they wake up, they might have their houses bulldozed. They might have like security guards knocking at their doors and then forcing them out of their houses. So I think if there's one word that I can use to describe the general feeling is tired, but it doesn't mean that they're not fighting anymore. They're still fighting until these days. Um, they have been getting help from NGOs, from activists, but I think in general, they feel like they're fighting an uphill battle. They feel like they don't have the resources to fight. For example, they might not have enough money to hire lawyers, for example. So that's why they have to rely on activists like Legal Aid Foundation that might give them like pro bono legal aids. Yeah, but I think they know that they're fighting like this big power. There are companies because a lot of companies that are operating in Indonesia, they are big companies with a lot of resources, a lot of political connection. So that's why I think these communities they feel tired.
Do you think that with all these processes and you mentioned these big powers, do you think that corruption, there's an argument there that to be made that corruption has a big role in how some of these decisions on what land is then cleared, like what forested land is then cleared? And I mean, I realize that also, reporting on corruption comes with its own risks, especially when you're talking about powerful people or in this case, a powerful industry. So do you think corruption plays a big role in this? And I guess how has reporting on corruption been for you? Has it been quite difficult?
Definitely, corruption is a major issue in Indonesia, and it plays a big role in terms of the rapid expansion of the palm oil industry and also in terms of the growing number of conflicts in the country. Because like I think I mentioned to you before that in order for a company to start operating in Indonesia, you need to have these different sets of licenses, right? And in some cases, companies, they might find it difficult to get these licenses without bribing local officials and without bribing government, the central government. So in some cases, they feel like they have no other option than to giving money to these government officials. And we actually have quite a number of corruption cases, whereas where the companies they bribe the government officials. So yeah, I think because of that, it is very difficult to have like a transparent and accountable government. Local communities, for example, they might have their areas being clearly zoned as community lands in a government map, but then companies, they can easily give money to government officials so that the officials will redraw the map. They will take out the local communities from the map, and then it will give opportunity for companies to come in and get the legal licenses. So that's why it is quite difficult to solve the problem in the industry without addressing corruption, because I think corruption is the root causes of all these problems in the plantation industry in Indonesia.
For example, like you mentioned the zoning maps. So I guess what I'm hearing is, like, for example, if there's a community in the zoning maps, for example, if somebody comes around and says, hey, can you just make a new map and pretend that no one lives there and then we can just demolish it? Is that kind of what happens?
Yeah, I think what happened is, for example, there's an area that is zoned as, let's say, a protected forest area, right? Because there's a lot of biodiversity there. It is known that a lot of wildlife is living there. But then there have been cases where government actually changed the status of the area from protected forest into non-forest area, so that way companies can come in, and start clearing the forest and start growing palm oil there.
Right. This kind of, it reminds me of a recent story. I don't think this was related to palm oil, but it was in Papua, in Indonesian Papua, about the indigenous people there being affected by the biomass industry, and where they basically cut down forests to burn in coal-fired power plants, for example. I mean, I know, like, for example, big economies like Japan and Korea, burn biomass or wood, better, in a less technical term, wood with their coal to claim carbon reductions on their energy supplies. And I think Indonesia is doing something similar, and I know Australia is looking at doing that as well. What's the impact of that now? This is, palm oil is, as we've been talking about, has this big, long history, right? And now you've got another pressure coming in from biomass industry now with countries trying to clean up their energy systems. And for some reason, wood is considered, clean and sustainable, but that wood in turn does have the potential to come from like an old growth forest in Indonesia, for example. I mean, how is this kind of affecting everything right now?
Yeah, so if we're talking about the biomass industry, I think Indonesia is gearing up to develop its biomass industry. So recently, the government has changed how the forest licensing works. So right now we have this forest license that is like universal. So it's, once you have this license, you can start doing a lot of things on your forest areas. For example, you can establish ecotourism there. You can cut down the trees and then sell the timbers. You can develop like non-forest resources like honey, for example. And another thing is you can develop the biomass industry in your areas, in your concessions. So I think this change in how the forest licensing works is one way, is like one way from the government to start developing the biomass industry. So it's like gearing up, for this industry to grow by making the licensing process easier and to have this universal license that is good for all kinds of activities in forest areas. If I'm not mistaken, there have been some companies that are interested in growing their biomass industry. They will start planting crops, monoculture crops that are specifically for biomass, so that these forest crops, these timbers, they will be burned at power plants. So I think we will see the biomass industry growing in the next few years.
Has there been any reports on the biomass industry in Indonesia, for example, is going in and using wood from, say, old growth forests as well, not plantations?
I'm not sure, but there have been some reports on the potential deforestation that might come from this development of the biomass industry. So I think right now the scale of the biomass industry is still small compared to other industries like palm oil and pulp and paper. But I think the main issue is what will happen to all these forests once this biomass industry really starts, kicking into high gear.
Yeah. I guess this is kind of a good segue into, I guess, the opposite situation in terms of like something to like carbon offsets, for example. Now, I mean, for anyone that's not aware, a carbon offset is basically like, a company can pay somebody, like a country like Indonesia, to prevent deforestation and then claim carbon reductions, right? Has there been any interest in Indonesia on carbon offsets, for example? Is the government pursuing this as a strategy to to reduce carbon emissions or to contribute to any goals?
Yeah, most definitely. I think it is quite similar to the biomass industry. I think it is something that will take off. I think probably the carbon trading and carbon offset programs, I think they're going to take off like sooner rather than later because the government is going to establish the marketplace for carbon trading. I think quite soon. The plan is to set up this marketplace officially for carbon trading. And then the government has already set up a number of regulations on carbon trading. There's still some key issues, for example, the pricing that haven't been decided yet. But I think in general, we have started to put in place the what is it like the tools and the mechanisms that are necessary for carbon trading. In terms of interest, I think there have been quite a few companies that have actually bought carbon credits from Indonesia. There are two that I know. One is Shell. If I'm not mistaken, they bought carbon credit from this REDD Plus project in Kalimantan, which is called Katingan. So they bought carbon credit from this carbon offset company back in 2019. And another one, the second one is Volkswagen. I think also in the same year, they also bought carbon credits from the Katingan REDD Plus project. So there's at least two companies that I know of that have already bought carbon credits from Indonesia. In terms of projects like the Katingan in Kalimantan that I mentioned to you before, there are actually at least 16 ecosystem restoration projects. And these 16 projects, they might start selling their carbon credits in near future, especially after we set up the marketplace.
Do you think, I mean, just from your personal opinion, do you think that there's a conflict between, for example, like the palm oil industry and the biomass industry, using up, cutting down trees and using up all the lands for their plantations, and then also you've got, this other situation on the other side where you've got, companies paying Indonesia or paying the state government to restore land and to protect land. I mean, to me, it seems like it's like this really fragile balancing act right now.
Yeah. Definitely. It is something that's like quite tricky to juggle. For example, if you're paying, companies to restore their forests so that, you can buy their carbon credits, there's still possibilities for these forests to disappear. Like, for example, in the next 20 or 30 years, there's no guarantee that these forests will remain standing by that time, right? And also, there's also an issue of shifting deforestation. For example, let's say you're paying for a company to protect these forests in one region, but then the deforestation that might have taken place in that region, they might go elsewhere. So it's a very, very tricky thing to juggle, and it is very important for stakeholders to address all these concerns about the carbon offset projects in Indonesia.
Yeah, I think even from if you think about this through a developmental lens as well, I mean, Indonesia as a country needs to find new markets as well in terms of, offsets is just potentially one of those markets, right? And I mean, there are some people who suggest and argue that, without offsets, you're taking away money to protect forests. But then other people argue that, it's all a bunch of bullshit, and that, carbon offsets aren't actually doing anything. But then you also have to ask yourself as well, it's like, well, there's a lot of people that could be helped by these offsets as well. So it's a delicate situation. There's a lot of different viewpoints, right?
Yeah, most definitely. I think we're still trying to figure out what is the best way to go forward that can both protect our forests, but also still, have some positive economic impacts. Because that's the $1 million question, right? How to to not cut down our forests, to basically to let our forests remain standing, but at the same time still generating money from that. I think that is something that we're still trying to figure out. One way to do it, one might be the carbon offset project, but as you know, there's still a lot of concerns and criticisms on that.
Has there been any interest from the Indonesian government in pursuing kind of, I know some governments are trying to do this for example, in Africa, right? In some countries in Africa, they're putting forth the idea that if they protect their forests, that they can claim carbon reductions in that sense. Is that also happening in Indonesia?
Most definitely. Like I mentioned before, the Indonesian government, they have started rolling out all these regulations as a basis of the carbon marketplace. In recent years, we have set up like an agency to collect all the money that can be used towards conservation. And this one possible source of this money is from the carbon trading mechanism and carbon offset mechanism. So definitely the government is definitely thinking about that. I think from what I heard, the government is quite excited about the prospect of carbon trading in Indonesia. Because as a country, we have a lot of carbon store because we still have vast amount of rainforests in the country, and some of them they are peatlands, which store even larger amount of carbon on the ground. So I think the government sees carbon trading as something that has this huge potential of generating income to the country.
Yeah, just being mindful of your time, Hans, I've just got one more question I'd like to pick your brain on, and that's to do with reforestation or restoring previously deforested lands. Has there been much of this happening in Indonesia lately, or at least talk of it?
Yeah. So this is quite a complicated topic because we actually have set up a target, quite an ambitious target, to reforest our lands. But due to a lot of factors like limited budget, we have actually done. The progress in that regard is still lacking. Let's pick one example. The target to restore peatlands in Indonesia. So the target is to restore, I think, nearly 3 million hectares of peatlands in the country, because these peatlands, they are rich in carbon, but at the same time they're actually they are also quite vulnerable to fires, especially during the dry season. So whenever these peatlands, they're being dried out to establish plantations like palm oil, they can get easily burned, and once they are burned, they will release all these huge emissions into the atmosphere, right? So the idea is for all these companies and also the government to restore the peatlands in the country, and the goal is like 2.6 million hectares, if I'm not mistaken. But a recent report, a media report, found that the actual amount of peatlands that have been restored is actually significantly lower than the government has claimed. So the government claimed that we have succeeded in restoring more than 3 million hectares of peatlands, but the actual figure is like 1 million hectares less than that. So there's definitely a lot of questions being asked towards whether all these government claims on reforestation and restoration is actually true or not.
Well, thanks so much, Hans. I really appreciate the time that you've taken to come on here, and also all the reporting that you've been doing on these really important issues. I really hope that more people start to begin to take notice about how important Indonesia is as a country in the world, and the role it has to play in climate change. So thank you very much. But before we sign off, is there anywhere that you would like to point people where they can follow you, for example?
Sure. So I'm on Twitter. Well, now it's X. You can find me at Hans_Nich, NICH. I'm also on LinkedIn. You can just type my name on LinkedIn and then it'll pop up. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I'll put all that information in the show notes. But thanks so much, Hans. It was a pleasure to talk to you. If you found this episode of Attributions valuable, please don't forget to subscribe to our podcast channel, follow us on social media, share it with your friends and with your network, and visit our website at www.climateimpactstracker.com for articles and more. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you again on the next episode of Attributions.